Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. So welcome back to this session of our discussion with regard to the traditional religious narrative in Islam around the state and religion and that relationship. And what we're looking at is a discussion that took place in 2015 and that was led by the scholar, the religious scholar and thinker, Javed Ahmed Ghamidi. And so these sessions are meant to examine some of his ideas on this, potentially push back on some things, but really to unpack what he said in order for a broader audience to appreciate it. So up to this point, we've had this discussion around, in our last session, around the second main point, the second of 5 main points that make up the traditional religious narrative. And this second point was the idea of jihad, or the concept of jihad, and what precisely that means and how that functions within the traditional religious narrative. And its connection, of course, was to that first point, which was the idea that part of the objective is the eradication, or the key objective is the eradication of disbelief, of shirk and associating partners with God, of this idea of apostasy. But really this notion of eradicating disbelief or kufr is then where jihad picks up, because jihad then becomes part of the method for doing that. It's to engage in this warfare with regard to the lands of kufr. And so the jurists, as we talked about, for Ghamidi, he notes the jurists then divide the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Kufr. And there is a permanent war footing as it relates to Dar al-Kufr, or Dar al-Harb, right, the land of war, because you are interested in engaging in the eradication of kufr in those lands, of getting rid of disbelief in those lands. To the point where Ghamidi Sahib discusses something which is, widely known within the fiqh legal literature, that jurists, the fuqaha, insisted oftentimes on the khalifa, or in the juristic literature, they'll refer to him as the imam, right? But the ruler, the leader of the Muslim community, insisted on that he engage in annual jihad campaigns against Dar al-Harb or Dar al-Kufr. And so you see that as part of the historical record, but within the legal treatises where this is encouraged. And it's said that this has to happen at least once a year as part of the duties of the ruler, right? And the duty is not so much connected to the idea that, hey, you need to sharpen your swords and stay active and fit. That's not what it's talking about. It's connecting to the notion that, hey, you have to be engaged in the eradication of kufr. And part of that engagement is to physically be involved in that, to push back against disbelief, potentially getting power over you or dominion in places near you, right? And so that becomes part of the religious narrative to push for an eradication of kufr by telling the ruler, you have to engage in these campaigns on a regular basis. Now, the third point then that we pick up from there, the third point that's part of the traditional narrative is the idea of the Caliphate. More specifically, the establishment of the Caliphate. And obviously, for many recent reasons, this has come into the sort of popular media and popular sort of discussion because of events that have been taking place in the Levant, in Iraq, in Syria, right? And the Background to that, though, is a bit useful as we even try to unpack some of these modern events. Where does the idea of the caliphate sort of come from? Well, there's a whole history to it, etc. But for our purposes, if we connect it back to this division of the world between Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, one of the questions that comes up is, how can there be more than one Dar al-Islam? There really should not be a situation where Dar al-Islam is divided. It can only be one. And so the traditional narrative will say, okay, well, this then means we have to establish some kind of caliphate, right? Some kind of caliphate. Now, historically, in the pre-modern period, we went through periods where the caliphates were strong and then diminished in their strength over time. And there are many caliphates, or many khalifas, many caliphs in the past who were actually really symbolic rulers, really didn't have serious power. But their very existence represented political unity, political cohesion, right? And that fits into this notion of Dar al-Islam as one part of the world and Dar al-Harb as another. Okay. Now take all of that and we look at nation states today in the post-colonial period. And for the traditional narrative, nation states are simply just a consequence of colonialism, right? The true goal, and especially early on in the post-colonial period, the true goal, as Ghamidi Saab notes out, was a type of pan-Islamism. And you see that in the writings of Muhammad Iqbal, you see that with Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, like you see these individuals putting out this vision, a pan-Islamic vision, which is premised on the notion of a caliphate. And why are they talking about it as pan-Islamism? Because as we have noted in earlier sessions, the introduction of colonial forces into the Muslim world represented a massive disruption, right? It didn't mean, it's a rupture of sorts. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that continue on, but it was a massive disruption. One of the reasons being that it also signified the end in a very total way of the historic Muslim caliphate, the historic caliphate that sort of united all of Dar al-Islam, right? At least symbolically. And so these scholars come about and they push pan-Islamism in order to kind of reconstitute things. And part of how we need to understand, if I might offer this, and I think this would align with how Ghamidi himself might think of this, but part of what we need to understand is that the efforts and activities in the post-colonial period are in some way or the other connected to the reconstituting, the reconstruction of this past civilization that existed. It is to reconstruct this caliphate. It is to reconstruct that dominion, that political power that existed and in which Islamic civilization thrived. And so the variety of efforts all seem to connect to that in some way. All right. Now, pan-Islamism very quickly is something that people realize is a difficult proposition. And especially as nation states are being created in line with the new realities of the modern world, which are built around these fixed borders, and especially in the post-colonial period where European powers are drawing these very rigid lines across the globe, outside the Muslim world, inside the Muslim world as well, nation states become something that need to be contended with. And so jurists and scholars have to consider how they want to approach this. And many of them eventually come to the conclusion that the first step that needs to take place is that these states that have come into existence, they need to be fixed. This isn't the end goal, but it's the first step. The end goal is removing the boundaries and establishing an Islamic polity. Right? For those scholars in this period who are all continuing on within this traditional narrative, that's the end goal, is to reconstruct it. Right? And they view with much skepticism the folks that are running these states. These newly formed states in the post-colonial period, they almost view them as agents of the colonial powers. But they realize, okay, our first step, before we can unify everything, we actually need to fix this or gain some power in these states. For many of them, that becomes the objective. As Ghamidi notes, a question then arises. Not so much just in the nation-state context, but in the context of Dar al-Islam. But it's relevant because the folks who are looking to fix these Muslim states are thinking about them in Dar al-Islam terms, right? Even though they're not looking at saying, okay, we're just going to go pan-Islamic, we're not going to recognize these nation states or their borders. They're saying, no, first step, we're going to do that, and we're going to build this Islamic polity here. But it's just a piece of the eventual collective Islamic polity, Islamic nation, if you will, or caliphate that is going to be built. But each piece of that has to be a Dar al-Islam in itself, to some degree within that traditional narrative. And so part of the question that comes up is, all right, well, what do we do about non-Muslims in Dar al-Islam? What's their status? And of course, we have these sort of categories of dhimmi and a variety, a few other statuses for non-Muslims within Dar al-Islam. But for all intents and purposes, within the traditional narrative, there's no notion of them, according to Ghamidi Sahib, there's no notion of them existing as equals, right? That's just not how, in some respects, any of the pre-modern world was really constructed. But within Dar al-Islam, they're essentially second-class citizens. They have certain rights. They have, might even have their own courts, their own this and that, but they're functioning within the polity as sort of unequal to the Muslims within. And part of that, look, shouldn't come as like a huge surprise, right? Because we are not dealing with governing entities or sort of states, if you will, in the medieval period that are like nation states. Your status in those territories was not simply based on where you were located. It was not simply based on where you happened to be born, right? Your status in connection to territory might exist in certain respects, but your status as it related to belief was the predominant status. That's very different from the modern nation state. And part of the question that we're going to get to, in which the counter narrative that Ghamidi will present, is what happens when you take that mindset of Darul Islam in the medieval period, where status within a society is not built on your presence in that society or in that territory, but built on another identity, your belief status. What happens when you take that mindset and you apply it within the modern context, in a modern nation state, in modern republics? Right? That's where certain types of friction occur. One example. But as Ghamidi notes, within sort of the traditional narrative, at best, these folks are second-class citizens. At best, non-Muslims in Darul Islam are second-class citizens. They cannot be equal. There is no other option within the classical narrative, he says. There's no space, there's no other type of reality within the classical narrative aside from these folks being in a subjugated status within Darul Islam. They can't even conceive of anything else. It's just outside of the realms of possibility within their reality. Similarly, their relationship with other nations, with other governing entities, is seen as an interim relationship that precedes the eventual ruling over these other folks. Right? It's a temporary relationship. Why? Because you have to eliminate kufr. You have to have Islam dominant within the traditional narrative. And so there has to be an engagement that may have periods of calm, but is still working for that objective to eradicate kufr and disbelief. Right? You may allow disbelief to exist for a period of time, but not forever. Right? You may want to think about this to some degree by using or conceptualizing the values that seem most important to us in this day and age, and replacing those with this value or this notion of kufr. So the idea of injustice in the modern period, many will agree that getting rid of injustice is a laudable goal, and that even if there are periods where injustice may be dominant, the goal to get rid of it doesn't change. In many respects, that is how kufr is seen by the classical jurists, the classical thinkers, and within the traditional narrative that then continues on into the modern period. It's an interim relationship. It's a temporary relationship where you give space for kufr to breathe because you are not yet at a place to overpower it. Now, if this is the case, and this is a narrative that's taught, this is also then a part of the mindset, but also where our passions, or the passions of those who are connected to this mindset, get excited, right? This notion of the Caliphate has deep meaning for Muslims across time periods, right? It's why people, even like Muhammad Iqbal, a poet, a thinker, a philosopher, is deeply wedded to the notion of the Caliphate. And he speaks about it in his poetry. Ghamidi Sahib mentions how he ends up being a fierce critic of nationalism. And those folks who, even some from the pulpit, who would promote an idea of national identity, Iqbal takes them to task. So what is this national identity you're speaking of? Right? For him, the Caliphate is the key to the Islamic civilization, the Islamic identity, the Islamic heritage. Right? And if you remove that, in some respects, there are dire consequences. Right? Now, he's fiercely against the nation state. Ghamidi Sahib points this out. He makes an interesting distinction, Ghamidi does, where he says, Iqbal is fiercely against the nation state to the point where he calls the nation state, he calls it the death of religion, right? And in some respects, that makes sense, right? It's putting forth, nationalism puts forth an alternative ideology to religion, an alternative identity to religious identity. So in that sense, it does potentially represent that death of religion, right? But he's speaking about it in a way where he doesn't have any issue with someone identifying as Arab or identifying as Palestinian or Malay or Punjabi or whatever else. That is sort of a geographic identity for him. It is that political identity that's premised on a nation state that then comes with notions of nationalism that then asks for this different type of allegiance. That's where he's sort of bemoaning, right? He considers that to be different, right? And in the modern period, that is one of the main things that really gets introduced. The main things, this major development, is the idea that identity ends up being built around the nation state or upon the nation state. And this wasn't present in the past. And so what you see is many major scholars, many major religious scholars and thinkers really go after the idea of nationalism because they view it and see it as a significant threat. Ghamidi Sahib points out how Maulana Maududi speaks about it in his book, which is roughly translated, titled The Issue of Nationalism, right? Iqbal brings it up in Javed Ahmed and some of his poetry, right? The idea of the Caliphate, of the Khilafate, right, in Urdu. It's not simply a term that refers to a way in which a territory will be governed. It's not simply a type of governance. It's not simply administrative. There is an entire history behind it. There is a deep attachment to it, right? Ghamidi Sahib points out that when the Caliphate ceased to exist in Turkey, right, when Kemal Ataturk essentially sort of ended the Caliphate, if you will, right? It was dying out, but essentially ended the Caliphate. It represented a moment of deep mourning for Muslims, deep mourning. The Muslim world truly mourned that. And there were a variety of movements, particularly in India and the subcontinent, that started off that were there to restore the Caliphate, right? To the point where many folks in India felt that they could petition the British to help in this, because they did not view the Caliphate as simply some kind of political organization. It had deep religious significance to it, right? And it's funny because at that point, Ghamidi Sahib notes that, there were certain Orientalists who kind of almost mockingly said, well, why are you mournful about a Turkish caliphate that has ceased to exist? Because according to the classical fuqaha, only the Quraysh should be the caliph, not someone who's Turkish. And to that, Ghamidi Sahib recounts there's this sort of khutbah, religious sermon that Maulana Abu Kalam Azad gives in response, and he states that, no, you've misunderstood. The place where the Prophet, peace be upon him, spoke about the Quraysh being, the only Quraysh can be the Khalifa, that's actually speaking about sort of his immediate successors. It's not a directive as such. It's just a report of him speaking about what's to come. A Turkish caliphate, Turks as Khalifas, there's no issue with that, Abu Kalam Azad notes. Right? Because the idea of the caliphate had such deep religious significance. Right? Deep religious significance. In some respects, all the major figures in the 20th century of Islamic history take up this cause in some way or the other. Right? It functions in the background, this sort of notion of restoring political power, restoring the caliphate, functions in the background. Right? Even in groups like the Jamaat-e-Islami. Right? You wouldn't think, there's certain groups that you think of right away and you know, oh yeah, they're movements for the Khilafah, like Hizb al-Tahrir. Right? But then other groups, you think, well, they're not really movements for the Khilafah. Like Jamaat-e-Islami doesn't really have that as such as something that they are known for. But if you look back, as Ghamidi Sahib points out, that in 1971, when the Jamaat-e-Islami lost in the election, it was quite a shock. It came as a shock to the party, to Maulana Maududi. They were convinced they would get at least 70-odd seats, right? And that even if they didn't get political power, that they would be hugely influential within parliament, that they would have that many seats. And that didn't happen. And after a few days of kind of taking this in, Maulana Maududi ends up giving a speech in a park where he lays out, among other things, the background to the Jamaat. And in that, you see that he starts the background of the Jamaat. He suggests that it begins with this Khilafah movement. Even there, it's connected, that this cause, this restoration of the past, that the Caliphate is incredibly important for that. So all of our conceptions today, Ghamidi Sahib says, of Daesh, for instance, and some of these, if you will, very rudimentary notions of the Caliphate, they don't do full justice or don't fully capture the way in which this idea of the Caliphate has captivated the Muslim imagination historically. And that needs to be understood because it's such an essential part of the traditional narrative. Right? If you want to understand the mindset that's created by the traditional narrative, the lengths that people are willing to go with regard to that narrative, then you need to understand the motivation and the power of the idea of the Caliphate and really the reestablishment of it that operates. For some, it's temporarily on pause. For others, it's quite forward as part of this narrative and mindset. But it's there. A good book in English to sort of unpack some of this, a bit academic, is Mona Hassan's book, The Longing for the Caliphate, which really sort of gets into some of the emotional attachment here and gives you a deeper sense, a more layered sense than kind of the popular discourse right now around the Caliphate because of certain actors in the Middle East. All right. So we've looked at the first point, the eradication of shirk, kufr, apostasy. That's the first point within the traditional narrative. We looked at the second point, which is the conception of jihad and how that connects to this goal of eradicating kufr and what precisely jihad ends up meaning and who has the authority for it and why that's consequential. And then we just looked at the third point within this narrative of the establishment or re-establishment of the Caliphate. And we have 2 more points to go, which we hope to bring together and look at, so that the 5 points that Ghamidi Saab believes to be the key notions within the traditional narrative are before us, and then we can get into the counter-narrative. Inshallah, I'll see you in the next session. وقولي قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم وسائر المسلمين. الحمد لله.